Good morning. It's so wonderful to see such a full house this morning, especially on such a glorious spring day. Wow, it's been a long winter, right? Like pretty gray. I am somebody who struggles with the gray, gloomy weather, a little bit prone to some melancholy during the winter months. And I have a 4-year-old at home who made an astute observation, I feel. He said to me recently, "Mama, the rain needs to give the sun a turn." True words, true words. So I feel a little tad bit guilty today that I have brought you all to gather on our first glorious day of spring in a windowless, dimly lit room. So even more thanks for that. I appreciate you all coming today and joining us for the conversation. Think Different on Stigma with our guest speaker, Pat Corrigan. It's really great to have you here for this conversation. My name is Nina Danielson. I am the Health Promotion Coordinator with Clackamas Behavioral Health, and I am so proud to be part of a team at the county who is thinking about what can we do to reduce stigma. And we're specifically looking right now about how can we reduce stigma internally within our department. So we're really excited to be embarking on this journey and learning from the research of Pat Corrigan. I saw Pat 2 years ago and was really just inspired by his presentation and learned so much from it. So I'm so excited that you all here today to also learn from Pat and think differently about stigma. I want to share with you all just quickly about our agenda for the day. Along with our guest speaker, Pat Corrigan, we're also going to be hearing from Mary Rambha, our Director of Behavioral Health. Mary's going to speak a little bit to how we are linking our stigma reduction efforts to our Zero Suicide initiative. We're going to hear from Pat, and then we're also going to hear from Rich Swift, our Director of Health, Housing, and Human Services. And Rich is going to speak specifically to what is that going to look like in terms of the culture of our workplace. How are we going to be thinking about reducing stigma internally? We'll break for lunch at 1 o'clock, and for those of you who RSVP'd, we welcome you to stay. At 2 o'clock, Pat is going to be hosting a mini Honest, Open, Proud workshop. And you'll be hearing a little bit about Honest, Open, Proud during the presentation, but we welcome you all if you can. I know it's a long day, but we welcome you all to stay for that. I do want to do just a few quick housekeeping notes. If you did RSVP for lunch, please do stay. We have Providence catering the lunch this afternoon, and they've put together an amazing meal for you all, so we're very appreciative of that. They are opening up the decks so you can at least get some sunshine during your lunch hour. Feel free to sit outside, pull your chairs out there. The classrooms across the way are also going to be open for folks who are staying for lunch. I do just ask that you respect the guidelines for no smoking. If you have your cell phones with you today, please remember to put them on silent or vibrate. If you need to take a call or attend to something, go ahead and step out into the hallway. That would be appreciated. We do, as you will notice, we have a film crew here today, and they are just filming the presentation so that we are able to share this with folks who weren't able to attend today but would like to see the presentation. So thank you to PGA for that. The bathrooms, if you need to use them at some point during the presentation, are going to be to your right down the hallway or to your left down the hallway. Is that right? I'm getting my directions. This way down the hallway. And also just a gentle reminder for folks, please take care of yourself throughout the presentation. Sit, stand, move your bodies around, whatever your level of comfort is for today. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Mary Rambha.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me? I knew you were going to say that. Is that better? A little bit? All right. Good morning. Thank you for being here. As Nina noted, my name is Mary Rambha, and I'm the director of Clackamas County Behavioral Health Division, and by the way, very proud director. And I'm going to sort of give a little bit of framework about what has led us here today. Back in October of 2015, our division actually launched our suicide prevention efforts. Many of you were actually in this room. It was a packed house. We actually had to turn people away, which is never what you actually want. And we really, we began a very intentional conversation that included our community members, county employees, and family members around preventing suicide in our community. And on that same day, we launched an important call to action with 3 simple words, 3 simple but yet profound words. Ask the question. What changes might we notice when we find the courage to reach out and check in with someone who is struggling and just ask the question, are you okay? Can I help? On that amazing day where we had a crowded house, I think it was actually gray and cold, so that worked out well, we heard from prevention specialists, crisis workers, and a very brave young person with lived experience of a suicide attempt, urging each of us to consider what we would need to change our individual, community, and institutional actions if we want to reduce the rate of suicide to 0. 0. A truly lofty goal to strive toward. Some may say it's an impossible goal. But in my corner of the world, here in Clackamas County, reducing suicide to 0 is a goal worthy of achieving. I'm so proud to be part of a community that has set this initiative in motion, and I briefly like to share with you some of the milestones we've reached since we were last together. Hopefully folks can see that. We've done a lot more than this, but we're hitting some of the highlights. So we took the concept and foundation of zero suicide and introduced it to all of the Behavioral Health Division employees, which are about 85 to 90. Both the behavioral health centers and our own Health, Housing, and Human Services Department have formed a zero suicide implementation team, and they actually all speak together, which is helpful too. We also recognize that individuals with lived experience are a crucial part of this work, and so they are important members of our teams. We did what we're calling Suicide Safer Care Touchpoints, which is a process that we mapped at Centerstone, which is our urgent mental health walk-in clinic, as a way to better understand how we actually might serve or support more intentionally those folks who are walking through our door. Also at Centerstone, we implemented for every individual coming through our door screening for suicide risk using the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Risk Assessment Scale. It's a long word, long name. And what I really want to highlight here is sometimes when you make process changes like that, you have to there's always some stragglers. You have to bring somebody along. And this group of clinicians embraced this wholeheartedly. They didn't hesitate in a moment. They recognized that what they were doing by asking some very simple, just brief questions was going to help us identify folks who were at risk. So I really just want to highlight that. Our H3S employees were actually invited to get trained to help by taking mental health first aid. And as of last week, 538 have been trained with only 39 to go. So any 39 in this room, get signed up. And I want to actually highlight that the most recent stats I've actually heard from Oregon, who's also invested heavily in mental health first aid training, is we've trained about 1,300 folks across the state. We make up 41% of those trained. So kudos to Clackamas County for that. We recognize that our culture is shifting, that our day-to-day work is changing. In fact, our day-to-day conversations about suicide, it's now becoming just part of our day-to-day language, which is really crucial for us to really move the needle on this. And that we believe that the work of suicide prevention is a collective responsibility. So we actually have almost all of our directors that make up H3S here because they also recognize that this is all of our responsibility. So we're really proud of that work that's happening. We also recognize that we need to be, both by having an intentional conversation, we also had to have an intentional mission statement. And so this is actually the mission statement for the implementation team specific to Behavioral Health Division. And I'm going to actually read it because I think it's important to give credence to it. So We guide the Zero Suicide Initiative in a thoughtful and responsible direction. The work we do includes a focus on early intervention and prevention, as well as providing suicide-safer care to those we serve at all points of contact. We address mental health stigma through promoting a culture of self-care, connection, and recovery. So I think this mission statement really highlights a very purposeful direction that we're going, which is also recognizing the role that stigma has in suicide. I am keenly aware that here in Clackamas County, we continue to lose lives to suicide, and that each of those lives lost and the impact it has on our community keeps our commitment to this mission at the forefront of my mind, and perhaps more importantly, my heart. So as we consider the work and culture shift of the Zero Suicide Initiative, I and many of our leaders and champions of this work understand that we will not be successful if we fail to address the issue of stigma. We see the barrier it creates around seeking help and the impact this has to the individual, their family, and their support system. We are too aware of the discrimination that is experienced by those who are affected by stigma. So today, a little over 2 years later, I'm very excited to continue a deepening of this conversation. As we've noted, we brought Patrick here today to talk about the research on stigma and mental health and learn what we can do to not only think differently, but act differently. I believe we can do better than raise awareness. I believe we can learn to act with compassion and heart, and I believe this work needs to begin in our own backyard. I'm going to share a little personal story with permission from my teenager, which is always very important because it will get back to him at some point. So my family has firsthand experience regarding stigma. I'm the very proud mama, similar to Nina, proud mama of a beautiful young 17-year-old. If we can make it through high school, that will be my saving grace, who's in the process of transitioning from a young woman to a very handsome young man. And although we have been fortunate, very fortunate so far to be embraced by family, friends, and our community on this journey, the stigma and judgment that exists is very real for me and my son. I worry daily about what will happen when he encounters someone at school or in the public who questions his choice of the bathroom he's using. I worry about the anxiety and depression that often accompanies our LGBTQ loved ones, especially our transgender loved ones. I worry about the times that he does not get to be called by his preferred name or pronoun because we're not quite ready to tell that family member or friend for fear of their response. So stigma is real, and this journey with my son has created an opportunity for me to question my own biases that can and do exist, even with the most compassionate of people, which I consider myself one of those to be. I know that we can and that we will do better to address stigma related to mental health. So, thank you for letting me share that personal story with permission from the 17-year-old, who one day will graduate, I promise. Sometimes the goals, you just gotta keep them short, guys. So on that note, I am very pleased to welcome Patrick Corrigan to join us today for a presentation on stigma and how it relates to mental health, and I'm gonna try to honor your very long list of accomplishments, sir. So Patrick is a distinguished professor of psychology at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Currently, he is the principal investigator of the National Consortium for Stigma and Empowerment, a collaboration of investigators and advocates for more than a dozen institutions. He has written more than 350 peer-reviewed articles, is editor emeritus of the American Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation, and editor of a new journal published by the American Psychological Association, Stigma and Health. Dr. Corrigan has authored or edited 15 books, most recently, The Stigma of Disease and Disability. So based on all of this, I don't know how you have time to be here, but we are absolutely pleased that you are. So please join me in a warm welcome for Patrick Corrigan.
Thank you for having me. I'm a little disoriented. Yesterday I was in Nashville, and last week I was in North Carolina, and I live in Chicago. So I'm glad to be here enjoying your son. I'm as convinced the stigma of mental illness is as big a problem for people with mental health challenges as the symptoms and disabilities themselves. And so I've spent the last 15 to 20 years trying to understand not only what stigma is, but much more importantly, how to fix it. And so what I wanted to share with you today is some brief introduction to stigma and ways to change it. Oregon is a lot different than Boston. When I'm in Boston, it's doctor this, doctor that, doctor this, and so I have to set ground rules. You guys are a lot friendlier. The ground rules is don't call me doctor. And the only people who call me doctor are my parents, and that represented an investment on their part. And don't call me Patrick, because that's what my wife calls me when I'm in trouble. So feel free to jump in anywhere along the line. I think I'll probably finish early if you have questions, but let's just jump right in. Nobody in the audience needs to really question whether there's a stigma of mental illness. It's pretty obvious. In fact, the one stereotype about people with mental illness is that they're dangerous, they're unpredictable, they're homicidal, and therefore it's not very hard to understand what the goal is. The goal is to stop it. And so over the last 15 to 20 years, people have been partnering, scientists have been partnering with people with lived experience to understand the best way to change stigma. The National Academy of Science, which is under the White House, actually was empowered a panel about 2 years ago to summarize all the research on the stigma of behavioral health. I was on that panel, and as a result of that, we came up with some pretty clear conclusions. One of the conclusions we came up with is that some approaches to stigma change actually are probably making it worse. And so I wanted to introduce to you the dodo bird. The dodo bird is from Alice in Wonderland, and in Alice in Wonderland, the dodo bird hosted a race and said, "Everybody is one and all must have prizes," which for a social scientist is a bad place to be. Because after doing our science, if we sort of end up thinking everything works, then we don't know what to do. So for example, most of you might recommend Sigmund Freud. They had a psychoanalysis, put him on the couch, let them free associate. The original research comparing that to Aaron Beck, who's the person frequently attributed for doing cognitive therapy, the original research suggests there's no difference between them both. They're both equally the same. And so the problem with that is we don't know what to do. I don't know what to teach, I don't know what to practice, I don't know what behavioral health agencies should fund. But even worse, especially for those of you who have a lot of experience, you realize now in retrospect, that research was about 50 years old, you realize now in retrospect that generally not only does cognitive therapy have better effects, but psychoanalysis can actually lead to unintended consequences, can make services for people with the most serious mental illness like psychosis worse. And so we're in the same ballpark with stigma change. There are good intentions and there are intentions that don't work so well. Now, I cut my teeth in a medical school. I was a psychiatry professor for 15 years. And when I started looking at stigma, I realized stigma is not an issue of medicine or health or science. Stigma is an issue of social justice, or should we say it's an issue of social injustice. And America has some outstanding examples of dealing with it. This is Dr. Kean coming across the Pettus Bridge on his way to Selma, Alabama to deal with racism in Alabama. What we've successfully done over the last 20, 30, 40 years, though we clearly have ways to go, is we've improved American attitudes about gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender. And actually the disability world has its own champions. The guy in the lower right, disabled too. The guy in the lower right is Justin Dart. He's frequently looked at as the Dr. King of disabilities. As you can see, he's in a wheelchair. People frequently credit the American with Disabilities Act to the effort he did for 20, 30 years. So, the interesting thing about social justice is I bet everybody in the room gets motivated by it because we're progressive and you want to run in and fix it. And sometimes running in and fixing things don't work so well. So before Bill Clinton became president, the military had an active effort to find the LGBT community, to find gays and lesbians who were in the military and drum them out. And so Clinton, being progressive at the time, realized the injustice it was. As a compromise, he pushed for don't ask, don't tell. If you don't tell Mr. Gay Soldier, we won't ask and we won't drum you out. Again, a good compromise at the time, but where we sit now, we realize it's just pushing people into the closet. And closetedness is a horrible place for LGBT. By the way, I appreciate your sharing with us, because in some ways, I understand a lot about the stigma of mental illness by looking at the stigma of LGBT and what they were able to accomplish. And lest anybody, I always want to qualify this, I do not believe gays should be back in the DSM and have mental health problems. I believe their journey and their victory is a great lesson for us. Another example, which is more close to home, I'm genetically Catholic. I went to Catholic grade school, high school, and college. I actually went to a Jesuit school. And so those of you who do not know, Jorge Bergoglio was the first Jesuit pope. He decided to name himself after St. Francis of Assisi because he was trying to go back to the New Testament and orient the church towards the poor and the weak. Again, unintentionally, and let me be clear, I think Pope Francis is cool. Unintentionally, in his inaugural mass, he wanted us to focus on the least important. The idea that somehow if you're poor or you're weak or you're mentally ill or a drug user, that you're less important than other people, which is sort of a rehash of the old notion of charity and social justice. The old notion is that we in power would bestow upon the little guy the opportunities we have, as opposed to what you eloquently know is that our job is to empower people so they can go for the resources that fit their needs. So thank you for the introduction. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I work in the area of psychiatric rehabilitation. For those who aren't quite clear of the difference, clinical psychologists are pretty much like psychiatrists, except we can't give pills. They're very much concerned about symptoms and disabilities. Rehab psychologists is regardless of your symptoms and disabilities, our goal is to get people to achieve their aspirations. And so I literally wrote the textbook on psych rehab, and I was editor of American Journal, and I do see myself as a scientist, but what's much more important is that I am a person with lived experience. So I have been hospitalized. I know what it's like to have my wife tell my 13-year-old daughter at the time what daddy's doing in the nut house. I have been under care. I've been alternately diagnosed with bipolar disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and depression. I took my pills this morning. And so stigma is not an abstraction for me. It's a real interest and goal. I think what I have to bring to it is this ability as a scientist to look at it. That said, where was Martin Luther King's statistician? Where was Gandhi's methodologist? They went out and did this stuff in huge ways and made major differences, and you as advocates can do the same. I think the worth of science in any way is the degree to which we can inform you better to go tear it down. And so what is stigma? A sociologist named Sam Kean wrote a book called Faces of the Enemy. By the way, these slides are available for all of you. The only hesitation is if you work for government, we email it to you, it won't get through your firewall, but otherwise you're welcome to use it however you like. Sam Kean wrote this book called Faces of the Enemy, and in it he looked at how groups in power, who were traditionally white men, kept other groups down using the media. And so perhaps one of the most heinous, gross examples in American history is what the white population did to the African American population. Scientists say Negroes still in ape stage. Thank you for putting that quote up. I agree, stigma is an issue of the heart. And we need to get hit in the heart from the very beginning to remember what it is. And the stigma of mental illness is in the same category as racism and sexism and the like. What's particularly concerned about this is this came from an 1890s medical textbook. Or representing groups as animals. This is Nazi-occupied Denmark, showing Jews as rats. You'll frequently find in cartoons and the like that mentally ill people are these stupid kind of little animal things. Or what one half of the population is done to the other, so the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. My wife is a public defender. She always said if I laugh at this, she would kill me and get away with it, which is true. If there's any good news about stigma, I would have seen this in my lifetime, this last slide. And if there's any good news, for the most part, Madison Avenue is not grossly using this. Perhaps they still have a way to go with the LGBT community, but you won't see Aunt Jemimas and little black Sambos, which are horribly disrespectful images of African Americans. Not so for mental illness. I mean, all you need to do on the way home today is listen to talk radio when they talk about psychos and wackos and nuts, and you see the stigma is really quite prominent. Where do you see it? You see it, the big stigma about mental illness. I mean, there's lots. We chose to be that way. We're incompetent. There's no hope. The big one is that we're dangerous. Because if you believe we're dangerous, you're not going to want to hire us or rent with us. So you see it in movies. The most popular cinematic maniac since Darth Vader, Nightmare on Elm Street, or Jason from Friday the 13th. You see it in newspapers. Now, the problem with having it in newspapers is they're supposed to be the source of information for us. But you see it in the New York Post, freed mental patient kills mom, or you see it in the Daily News, get the violent crazies off of our streets. Now, let's face the truth. These are tabloids, and this is what they're supposed to do. Well, I shouldn't say supposed to do, but that's how they generate money. There are other groups. This is the Reader, which is equivalent to Village Voice, maybe a very small version of the New Yorker, very serious, very well thought out, kind of an NPR in Chicago. The gentleman on the left, who's a physician, killed his wife in a drug-induced psychosis, ended up spending 15 years in Elgin Mental Health Center, which is the forensic facility, the criminal justice facility outside Chicago. By everybody's standards, was ready to be returned to his community. Ted Klein, a reporter, wrote a really balanced article, but the editor threw this headline on there, and he ended up spending at least another 2 years in jail. You see, in advertising, this offer could get you committed. Crazy Eddie's Record Asylum. To offer these deals, we'd have to be committed. Maniac out of control. The problem with advertising is how subtle and all-intrusive it is. This is actually a billboard in Washington, D.C., Lobster Lunacy. Now, at this point, I have to be honest, because I can be self-critical. Shouldn't we just lighten up a little bit? I mean, come on, isn't there anything wrong with a little sense of humor? The chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. Just as once upon a time, we might have thought that was an okay way to sell Kenwood appliances, we hugely realize that's no longer so. And so, can you make this out? This is a straitjacket that was filled with nuts, which won something called the Clio Award, which is the Academy Award of Advertising. You see it in comics. I love Gary Larson. But you know, there's two things wrong with this. One is just a disrespectful message on the pad. You're just plain nuts. And two is the psychiatrist is doing it. If he's doing it, it must be okay for everyone. Or, sir, these gentlemen from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission are here to explain new rules of mental illness in the workplace. Now, to understand this, you have to understand the history. The first George Bush signed the American with Disabilities Act in 1990. It was in place 5 years before anybody ever thought it applied to psychiatric disability. The EEOC put out a directive saying so, and you got results like this, that people with mental illness or Napoleon or in a straitjacket or an axe murderer and are not capable of assuming the roles that we would expect someone in a wheelchair or someone who needs support for their visual disorder. S is for Stanley. Stanley's a crazy murderer who likes to murder little boys and girls every Sunday morning. Are you afraid of Stanley? So parents my age, this is a Shel Silverstein book. Shel Silverstein is just a hugely respected author. I pulled this off my daughter's shelf when she was 4. Now, as I said, the big stigma, the one to really be concerned about, is that we're dangerous, but there are others. One's a benevolent stigma, and let's be clear, I don't ever think stigma can be benevolent or kind. It's the view that adults with serious mental illness are these big saps, these buffoons, And then as a result of that, they can't make decisions for themselves, and they need a benevolent figure like a doctor to tell them what to do. So you see it in The Dream Team. This is a movie with Christopher Lloyd, Peter Boyle, and Michael Keaton. There are 3 psych patients who get away from their keepers, having a zany, wacky day popping around Manhattan. And this actually captures both of them, me, myself, and Irene. On the left, you got the big simpleton view. On the right, you got the demonic view. This is a few years old. This is before anybody started talking to Hollywood about taming down their films. They tried. Jim Carrey at the time didn't see what's a big deal, which you may know is ironic, because since then he's come out with major depression, perhaps bipolar disorder. How to avoid hiring lemons, nuts, and flakes. An HR department in a major corporation came up with that. Is it any better? Some of those are old. Actually, some of these are old. Here's an example. To understand this, this is downstate Ohio. You're in a small town looking in the front window of a printing company. So pretend the woman's not there. You got a stool kicked over, 2 legs hanging down, a bottle of booze tipped over, and the sign contemplating suicide. Get your notes printed here. If that wasn't bad enough problem, she's the owner of the company, and when they tried to explain it to her, she didn't understand the big deal. Or my last example, Trenton State Hospital, for those of you who are fans of Beautiful Mind and John Nash, when he would relapse, this is where he would go. Had a fire, nobody hurt but structural damage. The next day, the headlines were roasted nuts. You would never, hopefully ever, see anybody make some pun on Latinos or blacks or women in that way, but clearly you see it continues. So I am a scientist. Let me try to make sense in English of what some of the science says. Again, I keep coming back to the big stigma about people with mental illnesses were dangerous. Now, if you're not certain about that, the take-home message is it is pretty complex, and I'd be glad to share with you the data. But pretty much the take-home message is people with serious mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than they are likely to be perpetrators themselves. And so it's a big question. Is how much does the population believe people with mental illness are dangerous? And so Joe Phelan and Bruce Link did a study comparing the attitudes in 1956 with the attitudes in 1996. And given the 40 years, and we're probably much more educated about it, it should be cut in half. And actually it was the reverse. Is during that time, the stigma of people with mental illness got worse. And it's consistent. They did it again in 2006. Now, we scientists like to talk about post-hocing the data. So why might that be? Probably the best guess is the media and it's convergent with these god-awful tragic shootings. Actually, I had a colleague who did a study in Australia that found after Sandy Hook, the stigma about people with mental illness in Australia got worse. So clearly, that's a challenge. So one of my jobs as a professor, as my students can tell you, is take everything complex and put it in one table. And so this is the one way of understanding stigma. In terms of understanding stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, I can understand racism by understanding the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. I can understand sexism, ageism, and so with mental illness. Let me give you an example. This is an example about a group that's stigmatized I know pretty well. The stereotypes about Irish Americans that we're all drunks and beat our wives. So how many people in this room know the stereotypes that all Irish Americans are drunks? So if you don't raise your hand and you were born in the United States, you're lying. You cannot live in a culture and not learn stereotypes. I bet we could come up with similar stereotypes about gays and women and people with gray hair. Prejudice is agreeing with it. Yep, that's right. And so we're never going to erase stereotypes. We just need to have people realize that they're not something to agree with. And that leads to emotions. I loathe them. And that leads to discrimination. So I'm not going to hire them or rent to them and the like. And so obviously what we're much more interested in is stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination about people with serious mental illness. The stereotype about us is that we're dangerous, but there are other ones. One of my favorite ones is that we choose to be that way. But when I was in the psych hospital, I chose to be in the psych hospital. The prejudice is the degree to which people agree with it, leading to the big emotion, which is that we're afraid of them. also leads to the notion that people with mental illness should be ashamed of themselves, which I always think is a double whammy of a serious mental illness. I mean, it's hard enough having symptoms of anxiety and depression because of the mental illness. On top of that, you have to add shame on you. Leading to discrimination, hiring them, serving them, or renting to them. And so it generates into three types. Public stigma is what we, the public, do when we agree with the stereotypes and discriminate against them. And so clearly evidence shows that people are less likely to get hired, even less likely to get reasonable accommodations, worse housing, legislators that won't support us. But this is one finding I find really screams out. So Druss did this study in the veterans in the VA. He looked at 40,000 charts of when veterans went in front of their primary care doc with rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, high blood pressure, such that they needed to go see a cardiologist. In 100% of the time, when the primary care doc thought they were just a regular guy, they got referred. If the primary care doc, because of what the patient said or what their charts said, they thought he had a substance abuse problem, it went down to 80% of the time. If they knew they had mental illness, it went down to 40% of the time. Now we're talking about people who are presenting symptoms such that they need to speak to a heart specialist and they're not getting referred. First, stigma is no longer this mild abstraction, it's an issue of life and death. And second, these are physicians doing this. Self-stigma is what happened when I, as a person with mental illness who lives in a society, goes around thinking these bad things about us, internalizes it. It clearly leads to decreased self-esteem, a feeling that I'm not a worthy person, or decreased self-efficacy, that I'm not able to do anything, or specifically the issue is why try? For us who work in rehabilitation, our goal is to help people achieve their work and independent living goals. They're going to say, why should I try to get a job? I'm not worthy of it, or why should I try to live on my own? I'm not able. Finally, the concern about stigma that's especially relevant to care seeking and suicide prevention is we have to understand how the stigma of mental illness works. I can pretty reliably look around the room and identify who is in the group that might be stigmatized for ethnicity, or who is in the group who might be stigmatized for gender. I cannot do that for mental illness. It is fundamentally in the closet. Similarly, I could not do that for the LGBT community. The way you get the stigma in mental illness is you get the label by going to care. So once you go see a psychiatrist, wham, you're one of those crazy folks you've been trying to avoid all your life. And once I know you're coming out of the clinic, or I know they're going to your behavioral health program, then they get the label. And so what people try to do is avoid the label. And the research about avoiding the label is really sobering. Research pretty consistently showed over the last 40 years that about half the people who would benefit from treatment don't go. Now that applies whether the person has the most serious of mental illnesses like schizophrenia, or a relatively benign condition like reactive depression because a loved one passed away. There are many reasons for that, many reasons that you as a public health group look at: access, availability, cultural competence, but one of them is stigma. And so we need to erase the stigma of mental illness, but you know, that's not enough. And you know who really hit it right is Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson, who passed the Civil Rights Act in 1965, actually gave the commencement address at Howard University that year. Howard University is a historically black college in Washington, D.C. He's speaking about racism here, but he said, "You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you're free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please." He said, really, to squelch racism, you need to promote affirming attitudes and actions. And so on our side of the world, we know that we squelch stigma to the degree that the public understands recovery is a reality. Now, recovery, as many of you know, is a really complex issue. We don't necessarily believe recovery means vanished, all your symptoms have gone. We don't believe that a person in a wheelchair, wow, all the challenges of being in a wheelchair go. But we believe with recovery they should be hopeful and they should pursue the goals they want and they should decide what those are. Attitudes are never enough. Actions need to occur as well. I think in some ways the reasonable accommodations clause of the ADA is an affirmative action for people with mental illness. The problem with reasonable accommodations is it's really hard for people to understand. For example, we all understand what reasonable accommodations are for a person in a wheelchair. By the way, talk about really blowing the community away. Adjusting a setting for a person in a wheelchair costs major constructual challenges. Now let's be clear, those are hugely due. But it's hard to understand what are reasonable accommodations for people with mental illness. Things like job coaches and having people be able to have a flexible schedule and being mindful of the effects of their medication. So I told you what stigma is. What we're much more interested in is how to fix it. Let me share one major concern about that, which is generally when people are trying to change stigma, they can come at it from two different perspectives. What we would call the services agenda and the rights agenda. And one of the things is it's not easy to do them both at the same time. For example, the services agenda, again, I'm a licensed psychologist. I've really gotten to the point that I understand there's a lot of evidence-based practices out there. And if the person getting the evidence-based practice, and let's be clear, we give people options and they choose amongst those. If they can get in it, it will help their health, but the stigma really dissuades them. And so the goal of anti-stigma programs is to tear down the stigma to get people into care. And that's, in some ways, looked at as a provider priority. So that's us, and the healthcare systems really want to tear down stigma to get people into care. That's different than the rights agenda. And the rights agenda, for me, I've learned, have come more from the grassroots advocates who have been victimized by stigma. They would say that stigma mental illness is like any civil rights violation, and therefore you want to tear it down to the degree that their opportunities improve. So you want to get rid of stigma to the degree that employers are more willing to hire a person with mental illness, or even more important, really provide reasonable accommodations. And here's the challenge, is these two agendas compete. For example, one of the oldest anti-stigma programs in the United States is in Australia called Beyond Blue. And what they like to do is they like to present mental illness as a treatable brain disorder. And what happens is when you define people by their illness, clearly the research shows you tend to view them as more different than you are. And any view of people as different to you are likely to lead to more discrimination. The other issue is services agenda tends to trump the rights agenda. 2 days ago, I was at Vanderbilt University because they're thinking about how to do a program for their students. And they, like you, clearly are concerned about suicide. They had 4 students who died by suicide. And so their focus was on that, sometimes perhaps ignoring what the message can do to undermine the person's rights. Now, let's me be clear about suicide. I was hospitalized for suicide. I am a provider. I've had 3 people in my life who have died by suicide. So I think suicide is a huge issue. And what you're doing to prevent suicide, you need to continue being top and present. You just need to be mindful at the same time how you're going to tackle this rights agenda too. So let me give you the one take-home phenomenon, the one take-home statement. This is the time to pay attention, and then you can nod off again. The one take-home message is that education, at least for adults, does not work. It's contact. It's the degree to which you interact with people with lived experience. And again, anecdotally, an example that makes sense to me is that my children escaped the homophobia that I lived with, not because they learned in health class that being gay was a genetic condition or hormonal or outside their control. It's by the time they got to school, they knew they had a gay uncle, and we had gay ministers, and we have gay friends. And it's that experience of people being out. But let me come back to that. I want to talk about the dodo bird effect. Let me talk to you about some examples that really don't work very well. And like any academic, this is my pet peeve. You want to change stigma, just change the words. For example, leprosy is now Hansen's disease, dementia is Alzheimer's, mental retardation, by act of Congress. Mental retardation is intellectual disability, mania is bipolar illness. Let's again be clear, I support all of these things. What I'm interested in is what kind of effect does it have on stigma? Our East Asian colleagues and friends are several steps ahead of us. If there's anybody Japanese in the room, I apologize for my pronunciation, but Japan has gone from Seishin Banetsu Byo to Togo Shito Sho, which for Japanese goes from mind split disease to integration disorder, which for Japanese, the first is fairly disrespectful, the second not so. Koreans have done it, Hong Kong, people in Singapore, China, they've all changed it. And this provides a great example to do research to see what of effect changing the words has. In the United States, or I should say in the Western world, there's this big push to change the name of schizophrenia, because schitz, just in the word, seems to cause a problem. And one big push, just as dementia went well, and we called it after this guy Alzheimer's, who did some awesome research on it. Bleuler syndrome is what people are wanting to call it. You may remember trivia from your abnormal psychology. Bleuler, who's Swiss, was the first guy who ever really described the elements of schizophrenia. So there have been 47 studies looking at the effect of changing the words on the general population and then on providers. And generally, the effect on the general population is zero. It has no effect on people. About 60% of the time, people don't even know you did it. And out of the other 40% of the time, I don't care what you call them, schizos, Bleuler syndrome, they're still nuts. Huge effect on providers. And the reason I had a huge effect on providers is why when the DSM-5 came along, I learned the new words right away because I wanted to get billed, I wanted to collect. You know the DSM-5, we cured Asperger's disorder in the DSM-5, right? Because they got rid of Asperger's disorder. So it has a big effect on providers. I'm not so sure it has an effect on the general population. And why is that a problem? Policy change, crazies now in a growing list of politically incorrect words, seems offensive to people of a certain mental state. The sanity challenged. The reason it's a problem is it makes it look easy. I mean, all you got to do to take care of stigma in Clackamas County is call it something else. And that just doesn't work that way. I mean, in my lifetime, we rightfully so have gone from the N-word to Negro to colored to black to African American. And don't get me wrong, all of that is really an agenda I approve. But do you really think the person who's a bigot, who's sitting there thinking they're a bigot, has changed their attitudes, or they're likely to discriminate, perhaps undercover, or likely to discriminate against a person when they stop calling them colored and start calling them African American? There's really not a lot of evidence that just changing the words has a big impact. And here's the other problem it has, is it causes word police. And the problem with word police is you're sitting around with people and you're tut-tutting them all the time. And the best way to undermine any kind of interaction is to tut-tut with people. For example, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has now officially said stigma is a stigmatizing word. It has been struck from their literature. They require you to strike it from what you do. SAMHSA paid for the National Academy of Science report. I did. And the first thing they come in is they told us we couldn't say stigma, to which one of the things I'm going to talk about later is you can't tell Americans not to do something. I mean, I said, you guys are a bunch of morons. I'm going to use the word I want. And I think the bigger issue is, do you and I want to fight about this word? I mean, there's truly enough other things to do that we don't want to derail in word fighting. Again, I agree person-first language has a big value, but the bigger hoop is to go one step further and see how you're going to change stigma. And so I really believe there's three ways of changing stigma, and probably the first one that comes to mind is education, because in looking at the literature, there have been a lot of education approaches. And so the question is, typically education is going through the myths of mental illness and contrasting it with the facts. So the myths that people choose to be that way, the fact is, at least for real, more serious mental illnesses or trauma or originated illnesses, it is outside their control. But what does public health show about education programs? One example is DARE. So perhaps young people here have been in it. My kids were in it with 6th to 8th grade. At one point, DARE was in 75% of all U.S. school districts, actually in 43 countries around the world. It was a nicely thought out program, traditionally done by police officers, traditionally going through drug paraphernalia and the whole risk of using drugs and alcohol. One of the first times that the federal government threw big bucks into something and evaluated it. They did 5 separate randomized controlled trials. 4 of them showed no effect. 1 of them showed significant differences. Kids who went to DARE were significantly more likely to use drugs and alcohol later. But even a more compelling one for me currently, especially with that guy in the White House, is vaccinations cause autism, right? That's a major public health concern to the degree not only that the children of parents who believe this are at risk themselves for childhood disorders, but in addition, they are likely to infect other kids who, because of their own biological challenges, cannot be vaccinated. And so they'll take these parents, frequently mothers, they'll take mothers and they'll put them in a room and they'll share the fact sheets from them. This is from the Center for Disease Control, and share videos, what happens when a child gets one of these childhood illnesses. And they've looked at results, and what they find is change in attitudes is almost zip, and change in behaviors is worse. And again, that's a recurrent issue, especially in Western worlds, especially in America, which is don't tell me what to think. Is anything that comes off as a protest will end up people digging in their heels. And so, lo and behold, mental health has done it. The National Institute of Mental Health in 1990 started the Decade of the Brain. It had many goals, one of which to push science into neuroscience, which is clearly an important goal. But it also was trying to decrease the stigma of mental illness. So if you showed them a PET scan and where they light up in the red lobe, which is occipital lobe, which is where you see things, that shows that schizophrenia is all a brain disorder. And what you're trying to do is 2 things. One is you're trying to decrease the blame. So if the public learns mental illness is a brain disorder, you're not likely to blame them as much, which is true. And we've actually showed that. But here's the big problem, is you're also going to believe they don't recover. You're going to believe they don't get any better. I mean, it's undercover, it's hardwired in. You might let go now, but you could snap at any minute. And that's the degree to which people are likely to hire individuals diagnosed with serious mental illness or rent to them or provide equal health care. So I'm sorry, I gotta be a scientist. And so one last body of knowledge. You know, the problem when we do research is you do a population study and put it on the shelf, and you do it and put it on the shelf, and you do it and put it on the shelf. And we got 16 studies from around the world looking at the degree to which the public believes mental illness and stigma. A meta-analysis is this one thing where you put all the books into a giant computer and squash it, and this is a summary of that. And we were looking at 2 things. One is the degree to which the world now understands that mental illness is a brain disorder, and 2, given they understand that it decreased stigma. And so this is looking at population studies, how population changed from 1990 to 2006. The next 4 graphs, the red line are public attitudes about people with schizophrenia, the brown line about depression. The first thing you see is the world is about 20% more understands that schizophrenia is a genetic disorder, and for that matter, that depression is too. And the world also about 20% more understands that schizophrenia is a brain disease and depression too. So we know more about it. Stigma should have gone down. Let me put this in perspective. This is in reverse. We weren't interested in whether you stigmatize people. We were interested in whether you would accept them. And so going down is bad. This is the degree over that period of time that the public would accept a person with schizophrenia as a coworker. The other thing you notice is the depression is flat, which is really interesting to me because I hear all the time is we've beaten the stigma of depression. I mean, partly because you turn on direct-to-consumer advertising and you see all these pharma presentations of depression being this kind of calm sort of thing. But the stigma for coworkers has gotten worse, and the stigma for neighbors is equally worse. So education, at least for adults, may have limited effects. That said, there may be benefits for adolescents. It may be benefits for children. We can talk more about that. So how do you change stigma? Another way is protest, is saying, stop thinking that way. I always like to say I was a 1960s voyeur. 1968 was the SDS, was at Grant Park in Chicago, and I'm from Chicago. I was 12, so I really wasn't in there throwing things, but I sort of absorbed it. And so I understand protest, and so research has really looked at the pros and cons of protest. And when we do this research, we'll show disrespectful images of people with of the media, get the violent crazies off of our streets, and we'll say, shame on us as a culture. We should stop that sort of view. We should sort of suppress that. The problem is when you tell a group to suppress something, it leads to a rebound effect. I'll demonstrate it now. This is an old social psych study. For the next few minutes, I do not want you to think about white bears. Keep them out of your head. I have a version of the Klondike bar bouncing around in my head. Telling people not to think things actually can make it worse. One of my favorite studies of all times, I didn't do it, but I love this study, is they took 100 college sophomores and they put them in 2 rooms and they hooked them up to plethysmographs, which are these things to see if they became sexually aroused. And they told this group, do not try to become sexually aroused. And they arose. Telling people not to think. We've actually done this research. We showed them a picture of a person with mental illness. And by the way, a picture of a person with mental illness looks like anybody's picture. We showed them a picture of a person with mental illness and said, do not think bad things about this person. And the attitude got worse. So if your goal is to go talk to Rotary, and by the way, I think Rotary is a great place to go because those are community leaders, and the degree to which you can empower them, get them in on it will help. Going and telling them shame on you will probably make the attitudes worse. But that said, as a behavioral approach, it might have a benefit. This too is a little bit old. Anybody even know the TV show Wonderland? Wonderland was on ABC in 2000. The first episode was set in a forensic unit, what do I want to say? Jail hospital for people with mental illness in Manhattan. In the first episode, a person with mental illness shot at 5 police officers and stabbed a pregnant psychiatrist in the belly with a hypodermic needle. Needless to say, people were concerned. NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, has a very interesting group called Stigma Busters. Stigma Busters kind of waxes and wanes depending on where NAMI's at. But this is an online community of people who organize and react to disrespectful images of people with mental illness. Originally, they were very early on this. Actually, I was in on this. We were pretty early on this. Originally, the goal was to write to ABC and tell them, come on, calm down a bit. That's actually probably the worst thing you can do because any letters are good letters. They wrote to the sponsors, and the sponsors pulled the show after 3 episodes with 10 unshown episodes, which at the time, if an episode was $1 million a show, they tossed $10 million. And it partly shows the economic influence of the community of people with mental illness because we're a pretty big community. But sometimes even that doesn't work. Psycho Doughnuts is a real donut shop. There's 2 of them, one in Campbell, the other one in San Jose, California. They have the Jason Nut, the suicide squeeze, the crazy face. You go in, the staff's dressed like Nurse Ratched. They have a padded cell. Once again, people sort of organized. You're not really trying to put them out of business. You're just asking to tune it down a little bit. NAMI Stigma Busters, the campaign was a little cute for my taste, but it's helped turn lemon donuts into lemonade, trying to get Psycho Doughnuts to tune it down. This time you had the reverse. Examiner.com is from the San Francisco Examiner. In it, Stan Razahi wrote, I'm an advocate of equal rights in a more tolerant world towards all people of different races, religion, gender, and sexual orientation, but that's it. Anything else is just moronic. I mean, sometimes saying you can't think that way is contrary to the way Americans think in the First Amendment, and people will push against it. As a matter of fact, Psycho Doughnuts went franchise. I haven't been on light recently, but there was an opportunity if you wanted, San Jose's not that far from you, if you wanted to open up a donut shop here. On top of it, they actually went and opened up hot dog business. So I've shared with you what I'm not really happy about, what I'm absolutely convinced about. is the way to change stigma, again, especially in adults, is contact. And that's sort of the weird way of saying the degree to which people with serious mental illness interact with others as peers. There's actually been a lot of research on this. What we do in our research is we work with a gentleman named Bob Lundeen. Bob and I feel like we're spiritually connected because we were born, graduated from 8th grade, high school, and college within about a month of each other. Unfortunately, when he graduated from college, he started this career in schizoaffective disorder. For most of you know, schizoaffective disorder is the person challenged by schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. When Bob tells his story, he feels it's important to talk about his childhood being unusual, because in Bob's case, he's very concerned about the stigma of adults with serious mental illness being born broken. The problem when you meet Bob is you go, for real? We talk about the for real effect. When you meet with Bob, especially if you're sort of naive to the community of people with mental health, you go, no way. I mean, you're articulate, you're smart. Actually, when I do my presentation, you might say, no way, because you're supposed to be drooling. You should come see me when I'm an inpatient, but here I seem very articulate. And so we talk about qualifying to the audience as a person with contact. And so the audience, generally, the naive audience thinks a person with serious mental illness has been hospitalized and been on meds for a while and had their major goals derailed and seen a psychiatrist. And you heard that's how I chose to introduce myself to get some sort of credibility. So Bob's mental illness is not test anxiety. I mean, he's been hospitalized about 9 times, including about 2 years ago. Gets in trouble with the law a lot, which is a problem with people with bipolar disorder. Has abused drugs and alcohol to try to manage it. And despite that, he's achieved. He and I worked at the University of Chicago together for about 8 years. He's now a peer support specialist, full-time peer support specialist for the DuPage County Department of Mental Health, which is the county just west of Chicago. He writes plays, which is awesome because he gets them on the Village Victoria Gardens, which is a local theater company in Chicago. About the only thing that's kind of symptomatic about Bob is he drives a silver Volkswagen Beetle, which goes to tell you people with mental illness don't have good taste. But otherwise, he's really being quite successful. So again, we've done research. How does it work? If you do a study, this is another meta-analysis. This represents 79 other studies we put in the computer, and it gave us the results. And we looked at what kind of effect does education in blue and contact in red have overall, have on attitudes, and have on behavior. And you can see the effect of contact is 2 to 3 times that. That's pre-post effects. In a separate paper, we looked at pre-follow-up. So we came along a month, 2 months, 3 months later. Any effects to education are mostly gone. Any effects to contact tend to remain. And so that's led us to what do we prescribe to be an effective way to change public stigma. And we would say it's targeted, local, credible, continuous contact. You know, the whole thing rests on contact. And so what's a little different sometimes about mental health stigma compared to the LGBT community or the African American community, I have a huge belief in ethnic rights and the rights of people of color, but I'm not of color. And so at best, I can be an ally. You would expect the rights of African Americans to be driven by African Americans. We would expect the rights of feminism to be driven by women. Actually, the obverse, if men were to take the lead, we'd be given all the wrong message. And so efforts to change the stigma of mental illness need to be driven by people with mental illness. Everybody else are allies. And so targets, I'd love to wave my magic wand now and get rid of the stigma everywhere, but it's not going to happen. And so what's more important is to be strategic about it and see who you want to target. Again, I'm a rehab psychologist, so I'm really big on helping people get back to work. And so I want to target employers. And I'm really big on helping people get a place they want to live. And really important to make sure they get the right health care. And the issue is every time you pick a target, you pick the change goal. So I think one of the things you want to push yourself is you're going to try to change stigma. What's going to happen as a result? And so we try to change stigma among employers so they're more likely to hire people with mental illness, or, as I said, that's a smaller problem compared to the bigger one of more likely to work with people in terms of reasonable accommodations. Or landlords who are willing to help life coaches walk with the person into their apartment, meet with them regularly, dealing with the stress of it. And the big thing is that it should be sort of a behavioral approach. Local. So we actually rolled this thing out some years ago in Canada. This is before the wall went up. And you probably know Canadians' views of American and legitimacy is not that great. And so if you're going to develop something in Canada, it needs to be done in Canada. Even more, as we know, we are really a heterogeneous country. I mean, I'm from the Midwest, the heartland. We believe everybody on the East Coast is pumped up on caffeine, and all you guys on the West Coast are high in marijuana. And if you're going to have any legitimacy, we need to do it in Illinois. Even in Illinois, again, a small geography. Chicago is the black bar up there. Chicago's about half the population of Illinois. And the other interesting thing about Illinois that I only realized is we're a long state. So it's actually about 450 miles to the bottom of the state. And anything that Chicago comes up with, the rest of the thing thinks has been inspired by the devil. So if you're going to develop something downstate, you need to develop in it. Have you ever heard the slogan, does it play in Peoria? Peoria is in Illinois, that's where the X is. And so we always say, does it play in Peoria? Of course you need to have Peorians do it. But even Peorians are heterogeneous people. You want to target it for city and neighborhoods and schools. One of the most interesting lessons we learned is in Chicago has two socially distinct African American neighborhoods. One's on the west side, one's on the south side. But I mean socially distinct, they organize totally separate. They have their own ministerial culture, their own ministerial bodies. In Chicago, wards are fiefdoms. They have their own politicians. If you want to do something on the west side, you better make sure you're working with people on the west side. Meeting Bob is once, but you also need to deal with credibility and continuity. In terms of credibility, I have not been in the military. I have worked with both the Department of Defense and the VA on military things. As you know, with the wars that we've been in, the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder has gone through the ceiling. If you add to that issues like depression and anxiety, our returning soldiers are having major troubles getting used to things. If you're going to do something in the military, Army talks to Army, sailors talk to sailors, and Marines are better than everybody else. So you have to work within that discipline. I mean, a Marine's going to have more credibility for other Marines. Also, by the way, generally, officers have credibility for enlisted personnel, but not the other way around. So enlisted personnel are willing to learn from officers, but officers are not willing to learn from enlisted personnel. And similarly, there's been more and more concern about first responders. First responders, the degree to which police officers, EMTs, firefighters are overwhelmed by the kind of stress they deal with, the degree to which you can appeal to their needs and get them involved in care that serves their goals. So the problem is once is not enough, and you can't keep meeting Bob over and over again. So the issue is, how do you package this into something that leads to a grand plan? So this is Pat's, you can see I had bipolar disorder. This is Pat's view, the one way to fix the stigma of mental illness. The way you look at it is you look at what we learned from the gay community. Is the gay community the degree to which 40, 50 years ago, brave, courageous men and women who came out hugely tore down the stigma. Now, none of us should be naive to think it's gone, but clearly we've taken big steps. And so there's a similar thing with coming out MAD. There are MAD Pride groups. There's a group in San Francisco called MAD Pride. And more people are coming out. And just since I've been here a couple times, I know some of you who are out and are big leaders in this regard. So the question is, who should come out? And so famous people are coming out. Rod Steiger won an Academy Award for In the Heat of the Night, and Patty Duke, who won an Academy Award for Helen Keller, and Mike Wallace. I love showing this picture to my students. These are famous people to which they go, who are these people? And so they've pushed me. I hope I can get it right. This is Demi Lovato, who has come out and talked about her anxiety disorder, back to Jim Carrey, who has both major depression and perhaps bipolar disorder. Leonardo DiCaprio also has an anxiety disorder. So these famous people are out. What kind of effect does it have? I think it has a limited effect. And we like to talk about the Thurgood Marshall effect. So most of you know Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court judge. And so when he was appointed by Lyndon Johnson, a lot of progressive people said, this will really change white attitudes about blacks. Because they'll look at him and they'll say, he's distinguished, so it must be for blacks. And it doesn't work that way. You compartmentalize. You say, he's not like other black people. Or John Nash, you say, he's not like other people with mental illness. He's a Nobel laureate. He's not like anybody. And so famous people might be a clarion call, but I really think the big impact for stigma change, and I haven't figured out an adjective to replace this with, is the average person. And so this is a book that we edited that was published about a year ago called Coming Out Proud, The Racist Stigma of Mental Illness. It's 45 stories of people with lived experience. I'm first. For those of you who got trained by John Larson, he's that guy on the motorcycle. He has this desire to race motorcycles at 100 miles an hour. I think his mental illness is still present. But this is an effort to try to host the idea that people with mental illness have a full life. That in addition to that, we expect and we demand solidarity. We don't expect to pass as normal. So again, once upon a time, I would say if you were gay, just act normal. Just keep it a secret. Nobody in this room would think that's an appropriate message now. And instead, what we would expect, and what I hope we do, is we stand with the LGBT community if we're allies. And so it's the same thing with people with mental illnesses. We're not asking to pass as normal. I mean, after all, that's a pretty hard thing to define anyway. But we're asking to stand with them from where they come. And so we developed a program called Honest, Open, Proud, to erase the stigma of mental illness. I did this with people with lived experience about 8 years ago from Australia, the US, and Canada. So for better or worse, the original version had a big English version to it. It's got 3 lessons. The first lesson is to consider the pros and cons of disclosing. Let's be clear, we are not trying to talk people into coming out. If we were, then we'd be as naive as anyone else. There's clearly risks in coming out. The second issue is that there are different ways to disclose. For example, Nina seems to be a nice person. I could take her out for coffee. I could say, what do you think of Silver Linings Playbook? She says, I'm sick and tired of those mentally ill people being passed as normal. You're probably not a good person to come out to. So you can test people. And the third thing is telling your story. We believe that for some people, again, for the gay community, I believe that some people, LGBT, learn to live and enjoy their life by interacting with peers, with other people in the gay community. So similarly, as you know, there are already peer support groups out there. We don't believe, it might depend on the part of the country you're in, but we don't believe we have to recreate those. We try to funnel people into it. John, the crazy guy in the motorcycle, was here about 2 months ago. And so we've trained 20 people on HOP in Oregon already. I don't know who you are. Would you stand if you went through the training? Oh, cool. So in my opinion, you are the heroes that are going to change stigma. The degree to which you can talk to peers. One of the things we found out is even if people don't come out, it can have a big impact on their sense of well-being because at least they now know it's their choice. The booster is we generally let people go away for a month, come back, how'd it go? In a successful period, we'll find about a third of the people came out. More to the point, a lot of people have just changed their views about coming out and what kind of impact it has. You know, one of the interesting things is we call it pride. Actually, the chapter I wrote in Coming Out Proud So I said, what's there to be proud of? Because, despite having a significant mental illness, it took me 14 years from when I graduated with a bachelor's degree to finish. Despite that, I was somehow able to get through it. I will tell you, my medicine helped, my psychiatrist helped, but my wife is a godsend. I got through it, but what I did overcoming my disability and what I continue to do overcoming my disability is much bigger accomplishment and something to be much prouder of. Even more though, what's part of pride is to admit who you are, and if you want, share it with the world. And so, people recognize this? You heathens, that's the Irish flag. If you ever want to do something well for your children, if you have a little boy, name them Patrick, because you never have to buy a drink on March 17th. Every March 17th in Chicago, we dye the Chicago River green. Every March 17th, I share this with everybody. I didn't do a thing in the world to have this issue of Irish, but it's part of who I am. And the idea of being authentic is if for some reason, and I don't know why it happens, I believe everybody in the room has had a mental illness, has been challenged by mental illness. Some of us are disabled by it. And I don't know why it happens, but sometime after living with it for 10, 15 years, it becomes part of who I am. And so I shouldn't have to keep that a secret if I don't want to. And so it really changes the dialogue. I was an intern and I first got my white coat. I learned and I told patients, don't ever admit you have a mental health problem. You need to keep it in the closet. You do not want to identify with a disease. Wrong issue, at least for a lot of people. What we realize in a more wiser time is as part of our human identity, this is part of who we are, at least some of us. And again, like being gay, or for example, like not necessarily having a college degree, or having any HIV positive, if you want to share it with people and you want to be whole, then you should be in a setting in a world that lets you do that. So I do a lot of speaking. I frequently speak on rehabilitation, and in doing that, I speak to you all as providers. What's the most effective ways for supported employment, supported independent living, and the like. But here I speak to you as advocates. And we have a lot of examples in the United States of awesome doesn't do justice to Dr. King, awesome people who are advocates for us. So we also have that for mental health. This is Clifford Beers. Clifford Beers was hospitalized in Illinois for 2 years, like 1901 to 1903, for serious mental illness. And he said in his book, I must fight in the open. And this is 1909. If you think it's hard now, what do you think it was like then? Clifford Beers went on to establish the mental hygiene program, which has since morphed into Mental Health America. So he's the guy who kicked off Mental Health America. And so I'd like to end with a prayer from another example of an awesome person who taught us about civil rights. Mahatma Gandhi said, let our first act every morning be to make the following resolve for the day. I shall not fear anyone on earth, I shall fear only God. I shall not bear ill will towards anyone. I shall not submit to injustice from anyone. I shall conquer untruth by truth, and in resisting untruth, I shall put up with all suffering. It's a great mantra for us. I wish you well on your journey. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, and also I thought for folks who are staying for lunch, if you want to stay, Pat's going to join us for lunch today. But I do want to just make sure we're on time. But if anybody has questions for Pat, please go ahead and ask. We just have a few minutes.
Oh, that's fun.
There you go.
So thank you very much. A lot of great information here today to think about. I think one thing when I think about stigma is if for peers in the peer world, which we're seeing more and more of, but how do we fight peers not necessarily, we'll support peer programs, but we can only pay you a little bit, or like unfortunately, some of the value in our society also comes from, monetary value. And if we don't have insurance and healthcare systems and counties and government, which I'm part of, giving equal value to peers, I feel that also makes it hard. And so that's an observation, not that I expect you to solve that problem.
So you know what's great about peers is we can get you cheap. And that's a problem. The one group in the United States that's really dealt with it well is the Department of Veterans Affairs. They hired peer support specialists in all 152 of their centers across the U.S. in the last 8 years. They're paid, it's civil service, so they have a system there. They're paid within the civil service. They're fully insured. I have to admit, one of the most interesting things, and I'm not sure if you've had this experience with peers, is sometimes they go, and I got you, now I don't know what to do with you. And so what happened in the VA is they hired a bunch of peers without giving them a portfolio of responsibilities. June 5th and 6th, John Larson is spending time in Orlando to train 152 peers on Honest, Open, Proud, and add that to their portfolio there. Yes?
So when we're talking about stigma, I'm the parent of a youth who had been hospitalized when she was a teenager for suicide attempts and mental illness, and she's doing well today. I always like to tell people that. But a lot of this stigmatizing language that was used by healthcare professionals and blaming parents, and if we just parented differently, our children might not have the challenges they have. And I was just wondering if you could speak to this aspect of coming out in contact with healthcare providers, because a lot of parents that I work with are very angry that when we turn to the healthcare providers and professionals who we feel ought to know more than we do, and then we get this kind of response, it's easier to be angry. Can you speak to a little bit of how we as peers in the room and activists can continue to be demonstrating that contact with healthcare providers?
So a sobering research finding is if you look at all professionals, so if you look at plumbers and lawyers and electricians, the most stigmatizing profession is psychiatrists. By the way, the second most are clinical psychologists. If we're trying to understand, I never excuse it, but if we're trying to understand, it's perhaps because psychiatrists see people when really acutely ill, where risk is high, and so you sort of reduce them down to that equation. It's getting better. I think one of the reasons it gets better is because recovery, recovery is an idea that comes from the community of people with lived experience, and they should get an Albert Einstein Award. I didn't believe recovery when I heard it. I thought it was this political correct stuff. Recovery is really changing the story, because now we understand recovery, hope, achieving goals, regardless of what people's disabilities is real. That should be extending to families. The research suggests it's getting better. And what we did in a recent study for nursing students is we paired them with mentors, and the mentors were people with lived experience, which really turns the whole thing on their head. Because, again, when I learned it I was a great white hope, then all these mental patients were 6 steps below me. And they're learning as students that this person is not your equal, he or she's your mentor. That's had big effects. I think people who are trying to do that in psychiatry departments, I think the new generation of psychiatrists and clinical psychologists are getting better. Families being angry, that's pretty much where NAMI came from. And by the way, clearly a justifiable response. If I was your plumber and you were angry with me, I'm doing something wrong. If you're a person with lived experience or a family member and you're angry with me, I should look at the quality of care I'm giving. Yes?
So kind of on that note, and I'm going to miss your presentation later, which I'm sad about, but in terms of coming out and disclosure, one of the things that I have struggled with families is family members who want to come out and disclose about someone that they love, but the person that they love wants no part of it and doesn't want that information out there, even in their community. and the challenge of how to navigate that and help a family or a community navigate that.
So a family, which includes, let's make it simple, which includes the parents and the young adult with mental illness, experiences two kinds of stigma. The adult child experiences the stigma I told you about. The family experiences stigma by association. Generally, in the gay community, we'd say you'd never out anybody. So that's probably a first step to which you would begin with. That said, I think there's legitimacy for family to deal with the stigma by association. But you're right, it's a tough place if the loved one who has the disorder won't do that. I mean, again, what you saw from Mary up front is that your son admitted to this. And so, admitted? That's not an appropriate word. Approved. Approved of your message. Language does matter. So it's a tough one. Yes?
So it's my understanding that education doesn't work for adults in destigmatizing a subject. What about for young children and then like teenage children?
So two things. One is, as a scientist, doing research on young children and teenage children is exponentially harder. So one of the realities you have is you just don't have a lot of research done on them. And obviously the reason it's problems, I need to not only get the consent of the kid, but I need it of their parents. I think there's probably some reality is by the time you get to adult, whether you know it all or not, you think you do. And I think children might be more willing to think they don't. I do think there's another issue to be aware of, which is mental health literacy versus education to decrease stigma. Mental health literacy is what mental health first aid does so well. And what that's based on is that a lot of people out there don't understand when they're depressed and not getting out of bed, or can't sit still. That's this thing called depression, and don't understand that, you know, you can go to a doctor, you might go to a minister, you can go to 18 different ways to get help. That's what mental health first aid does. Generally, that kind of education doesn't change stigma much, but still really important for people to be good consumers of behavioral health care. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Pat. It's so good to have you here. And I do want to do a shout out to our HOP facilitators. We were very fortunate to have John Larson, a colleague of Pat's, come out in April to do a train the trainer. So we are very fortunate that we now have the availability to do HOP workshops in our community, and those will be implemented in the near future. So we will keep you all posted about when those are happening. I do now want to turn it over to our director, and Rich, I'm just going to get the slideshow set up for you here, but you can go ahead and get started. Just 1 second here.
So how do I just click on
And then
this
you're
one?
just going to click forward
Two
right
slides,
here.
right?
Yep.
All right,
Just
sweet.
those 2 slides. Thank you.
So I'm Rich Swift. I'm the Director of Health, Housing, Human Services, and I usually give the clicker to someone else, but I only have 2 slides, so I think I can actually manage this. So when I get up and I talk to a bunch of folk, one of the things I actually like to do is I try and come to a sort of a quiet place within myself before I start talking. But Pat, I got to tell you, your presentation has got me pinging so much because our intersects are actually surprising. I was born in Evanston, Illinois. Came this close to going to University of Chicago, chose Notre Dame instead. I'm Jesuit, trained from high school. Grew up in an area, I'm Italian-Irish, and grew up in an area where if a person came to me presented as male, and I didn't know their name, it was a 50-50. It was like Mike. If she presented as female, I could probably get away with Mary or Maureen or Colleen. If I hit those 3, I could probably, nail it. And, what we're trying to do in ACE3S, because with the resources that we have in our department, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to take a look at how do we have these conversations and how do we talk about people whose experience with mental illness is something that we don't want it to be. We want it to be about acceptance. My own personal experience, I come from I think a long and storied tradition of mental illness in my family. It goes back to my great-grandmother. I experienced it in my immediate family. And I am, I think my immediate family is lucky. There's 2 master-prepared parents who can bring serious resource to the issue, and there's a lot of luck related to that. Not every family has that experience who can establish that type of atmosphere and response to the issue. And so what we're going to be doing here with H3S is going forward with how to learn how to have these conversations, how to build a place where people can be who they are, and they can be who they are with respect, they're honored, their experience is their experience. If I go back to about the age of 10, I had an aunt who died of cancer. I was close to her. She was my mother's favorite sister, and her cancer experience, we didn't talk about it. It echoes in the family still to this day. Now I come forward, and we have staff in H3S who are dealing with breast cancer and other types of cancer. We're talking about it. We're creating a space for them to be who they are. We are actually creating a space for their family members to be who they are. We have staff who have family members who have cancer, and we're talking about this. And it makes it so much easier. They can occupy a state of health that is supported by everyone else around them. And that's where I want to head with this county. We've trained up staff, I think, well with mental health first aid. It's been, I think, an excellent response. I would actually like to set our goal that we got 400,000 residents in this county. I would like to see every single one of them with mental health first aid. That's a big goal, but I don't know, maybe we might get there. The other big goal is preventing and eliminating suicide. But the first piece of this is we cannot really do that unless we take a step towards how do we talk about this and how do we build a place for people to be who they are. And so what we're going to be doing in the department, and I go back to something that Sheriff Roberts did. He put out an article which I thought was fantastic, and it was about means reduction and talking about, what are the probabilities of suicide as a successful attempt if there's a gun in the house or a weapon in the house. And it was well thought out. One pager was easy to read, and there were, I don't know how many different comments. There were a lot, and I read every single one of them. Staff were like, why did you do that? Because it is important, we have to, if we're going to be able to have these conversations, we have to know how people approach this and what they think about it. Because you have to take people where they're at and bring it, because everyone is bringing their own perspective on this, and it's a journey. So what we're going to do is we're going to be having and hosting listening sessions throughout the department, inviting people from the divisions to come together to talk about, this issue, and create a space for them where we asking questions, and then we're going to be collecting that because we're going to be informing ourselves about going forward, how do we do this out in the community? Because this is a lot of work, and how we approach this in the community, we don't have a resource deep bench on this. And so we're going to be reaching out to the rest of the county, law enforcement across the county, the sheriff and other law enforcement entities, fire, ambulance have been awesome partners in this so far, but we got a lot of work to do ahead of us. So we're going to start this. When actually do we greenlight this? Soon? Okay, awesome. So for folks who really want to participate in this, I think you're going to be talking about who to talk to and who to ping if you want to get involved in this, and I invite your involvement and participation because this is important work. Because if we can actually penetrate on this, if we can actually do something about people's ability to be who they are, and that is with respect, this will be a very different place to exist within, and it's going to be, I think, sunny every day. I got to admit, Monday I hit the wall. I mean, I cannot look at the weather reports anymore. I was so frustrated with the weather, couldn't stand it. And so this is a great, I was very pleased to come out here and see that we had a sunny day for this, and so I want to conclude because I want folks, I'm getting 3 minutes. It'll be less than that, I want to, give everyone some opportunity to get together and talk, have some food, and enjoy the rest of the day because it is beautiful outside. So thank you. And I want to appreciate our staff here. Just did just a fantastic job. Gally, Nina, who else do we have here? There's Kathy. She's Aaron, others. I'm going to leave somebody out, I know, because I'm going to have to go row by row pointing folks out. And just a lot of work. And it makes my job so much easier because really they bring the fantastic ideas, and I just look at them and say, yeah, that sounds like the right thing to do. Let's do that. So I'm really, really lucky. So thank you.
We've got a timekeeper down here who's got a tiny tiger ready to pounce if you go over the limit. So yeah, as Rich mentioned, and I think really this speaks to what Pat was talking about, we really want to think about a targeted community, and in our conversations and as our team back at Clackamas County within Health, Housing, and Human Services was talking about this, our target community is our workplace. And that's really where we're going to begin these conversations, because if we can't really look at this ourselves, many of us come to this work as clinicians and have had the training where you don't talk about yourself. And so how is that really going to look different in our workplace? How are we going to be able to show up to work? And we want to hear from our workplace community about what would that look like. So we actually are going to be continuing to work with Pat's team. They're going to be helping us with some technical assistance as we move forward with these listening sessions. We have some handouts. Beth from PGA, did everybody get a handout today? They're out on the table. We have a special inbox. Did the inbox get set up? We have can you remind us, Beth? So if you are here on behalf of Clackamas County Health, Housing, and Human Services and you want to get involved in the listening sessions, you can email us at stopstigma@clackamas.us, and we will get you signed up to be part of those listening sessions. Again, some other ways to get involved. The NAMI Walk is coming up on May 19th. I know we had some NAMI folks in here. I think they had to leave a little bit early today. We are also going to be doing the Out of the Darkness Walk coming up in October. We encourage any employee to share their voice in a listening session. And we also, based on the conversation today, connect with somebody, be willing to hear somebody's story. It's why we continue with our ask the question, call to action, ask the question. Just reach out and check in with somebody to encourage those conversations. I want to thank you all for being here today. We are really looking forward to next steps within H3S. For those of you who are not within our H3S community that have come from the state, I know we have representatives here from our state services and from elsewhere throughout the community. We look forward to staying in touch with you and staying connected as we learn what we can change in our own backyard, so we hope to stay connected. I do want to do a shout out today, as Rich mentioned, this putting together an event like this, I am so fortunate that we have leadership that are champions of this work. It would not be possible to bring events and to bring speakers like Pat Corrigan to our community without their championing these efforts. So I want to do a big shout out to our leadership in the room today. Thank you so much for supporting this work. I also want to thank the behavioral health promotion team, our zero suicide implementation teams. I want to give a shout out to Providence for the use of the space today and for the lunch that you will all be sharing in the sun very soon. I'm also wanting to do a special shout out to our public government affairs, who is filming today and has done so much to make the work that we do visible to our community. They have done an outstanding job of partnering with us, and we are very fortunate to have them. I do want to mention on on a sad note that we learned recently that a producer with PGA, Mark Ivanish, passed away last week. And so we just wanted to say to the PGA team and to the community that works with him, Mark's family, that we are very sorry for this loss. Mark worked with us on many, many projects, and so we will remember him fondly, and our hearts go out to his community and family.